This case has not yet been fully explained or solved and remains one of the most intricate investigations into the crimes of the 20th century's most gruesome maniacs. It should be noted that Bruno Lütke is one of the 8 most feared maniacs. Nevertheless, a more detailed study raises many questions concerning both the methods of interrogating the criminal and how the authorities of the Third Reich subsequently got rid of the investigators who handled the most notorious criminal offense, which began in 1923 and which ended already in Hitler's Germany. This is X-War History Channel. Let's begin. Between 1923 and 1943, police regularly found the bodies of strangled and then raped women in Berlin, and the perpetrator acted more than cautiously, leaving literally no trace at all. It was only after the last murder that someone paid attention to a strange character that the case began to unfold with simply remarkable speed. So, on January 31st, 1943, a special commission of inquiry into the murders of a 53-year-old citizen who had gone to the woods to gather firewood but had been strangled and then raped was sent to the scene. Closers testified that the woman's purse was missing. Once the crime lab pulled up the archive, it turned out that similar crimes had been going on for the past 20 years. A certain pattern was established. Berlin Police Commissioner Heinz Franz, who was assigned to handle the case, decided to act rather creatively. On his orders, the files of those who could have committed such a crime were delivered. Still, some of the suspects at the time were in prison, some were fighting at the front, and some had long since gone to their deaths. There was only one candidate left, and he was suspected after another such murder was committed shortly thereafter. Furthermore, time was running out and the head of the Homicide Commission, Obersturmbannführer SS Togodz, least of all wanted to go to the front. Therefore, he gave his subordinate, Franz, explicit instructions after the murder of a 53-year-old woman in the Kapenick forest. "Come on, Franz, assemble a commission and take the Kapenick case. And pity for you if you fail it, Parteigenossen. Well, then you can immediately write a report on sending to the front." Obviously, the last thing Heinz Franz, like his boss, wanted to do was to rot in the trenches, so a possible suspect was apprehended. Bruno Lütke, a regional town idiot who was considered completely harmless. In accordance with the race purity program, Lütke was sterilized as mentally incompetent. For the same reason, he was never drafted into the army. Lütke worked part-time as a laundromat and as a carter and delivery man. At the same time, the outwardly harmless fool wielded considerable strength, which, according to Heinz Franz, indirectly indicated the possibility of committing all those crimes. The town idiot was apprehended, but at first he was utterly unable or unwilling to understand what was wanted of him. But the criminal police did not eat bread for nothing, right? And Franz began to look for things of great value to Lütke. It turned out that 2 absolutely trivial things, good food and smoking a pipe. While there was comparatively no problem with food, getting good quality tobacco in Berlin in 1943 was quite difficult. However, this problem was also solved. And then the weird things began to happen. Despite his mental deficiency, Lütke had a phenomenal memory. Franz took advantage of this. His little experiment looked rather tricky. In the beginning, he read out to Lütke the materials of a criminal case of one of the murders, and the next day, expecting a hearty and tasty lunch, Lütke reproduced all the details almost word by word. When shortly after he was taken to the scene of the murder of a 53-year-old woman, he accurately identified both the murder scene and how he strangled and then raped the unfortunate woman. However, when asked by other investigators about the purse, Bruno could not give a clear answer, arguing that he had simply forgotten about it. It was recorded in the visitation register that the night before he went to the crime scene, Franz had summoned Lütke and talked to him for almost an hour and a half. A record of the first confession is preserved. In the presence of Obersecretary of Criminal Police Heinz Müller, Lütke confessed to the crime, but stated that he could not recall the exact details, but would be able to do so on the scene. On the spot, which was noticed by many, Bruno often turned to Franz for hints. In this simple scheme, Franz began to solve all similar murders one by one, from 1923 onward. The weak-minded man, during a visit to his friend Franz, listened attentively to what was read to him and then reproduced everything again, almost word by word. There is an interesting record of this too, when it was not Heinz Franz who interrogated Lütke, but someone else. Lütke was reminded that he had harassed various women with immoral molestations before. Lütke responded that he may have strangled several other women. In order to remember the details, he said he needed to reflect in peace. He promised to say more tomorrow. Before that very promising tomorrow, the accused met with the commissioner, and the case moved forward with unusual speed. Eventually, Bruno Lütke confessed to all of the 84 murders. However, due to insufficient evidence, he was charged with only 51 crimes. Interestingly enough, during the investigation, Bruno confessed to having committed a double murder when an elderly couple had been stabbed to death. Of course, he was able to tell the details of the crime the next day, for which, by tradition, he was rewarded with a delicious lunch and excellent tobacco. The investigators were not even embarrassed by the fact of the preliminary conclusion of their colleagues made at the scene of the double murder. The execution of a double homicide suggests beyond doubt that the crime was committed by more than one killer. And the inconsistencies multiplied one after another. Even after the war, researchers of the case could not understand how a man with the intellect of a 10-year-old child could commit such crimes without leaving any trace. Moreover, and importantly, Lütke claimed to have committed crimes only in Berlin, but one day, after a conversation with his friend Franz, he unexpectedly declared, "I want to confess to the killing of a woman near Genthin. I can't say exactly when it happened, but it wasn't that long ago." Despite the fierce opposition of the Genthin police, who by then had actually solved the murder and apprehended the criminal, the case was transferred to Berlin after the intervention of Himmler's close associate. And then the campaign for an open trial began, which was to show how important it was to protect Germans from such weak-minded men by giving the latter an easy and painless death. All of the unsolved murders were withdrawn from the police departments at once and sent to Berlin, where Franz, having picked out about 100 of the loudest, began the traditional conversations with his ward. As a matter of fact, other members of the Commission of the Inquiry into the murders joined in these conversations. They even slept in the same cell with Lütke when he was bored and went to the baths with him. It was strictly forbidden to tell anyone that Lütke would be punished. On the contrary, he was assured that he would soon go home. Moreover, Bruno was even put on a special allowance, of which there has been preserved an amazing document. In order to keep him in good spirits, and consequently in a great condition favorable to interrogation, he must be supplied by the commission's staff with sufficient food and tobacco. In truth, not everyone in the police took it all for granted. During a meeting of the Special Commission in Hamburg, all Franz's assumptions were mercilessly shattered by Councillor Faulhaber, head of the Hamburg Criminal Police, who not only doubted that Lütke was the murderer, but also rather flatly declared that, "Alright, listen, Lütke, as a result of over 6 months of almost daily interrogation, has developed a kind of willingness to confess syndrome, which, as experience shows, leads the highly mentally unstable Lütke to make the so-called voluntary confessions." Despite the trial, at which Lütke confused himself and claimed that everything was on record, he was found guilty and sent for experiments to the Vienna prison at the Central Forensic Institute of the Security Police, where they experimented on the unfortunate men in pressure cells. Rumor had it that Lütke had even been castrated. Losing the opportunity for a hearty meal and tobacco, Lütke became violent, so they got him sedated with injections and then began subjecting him to tests in a low-pressure cell. According to one report, the poor man died during one of these experiments. According to others, an injection of potassium cyanide was administered to Lütke instead of a sedative on orders from Berlin. Heinz Franz himself was sent to the front and died near Berlin. But his superior, Obersturmbannführer SS Togotz, after the war had ended, remained the chief of Berlin's criminal police, retiring with honor and receiving a modest pension until his death. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to X War History and leave a like.